Paula Fredriksen, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So today we're going to talk about this book, Ancient Christianities, the First 500 Years. See if I can get it into the screen here. Absolutely fabulous, readable introduction to early Christianity from so many different directions. And this, I was saying to you before we went on the air, this is now going to be one of my go-to recommendations for anybody wanting to kind of get a bird's eye view of what happened in early Christianity. When I looked at this on on Amazon, I looked at the cover and I thought, like, this is going to have to be 600 pages because it's an introduction to early Christianity. But it's 200 pages. It's really readable, incredibly accessible. The extent to which you could take complicated theological discussions, condense them into a paragraph or two, and still do a beautiful job of helping me understand what was happening. It's just, I can't say enough about it. It's a really fantastic book. So what I'd like to do today, essentially in the book, you take 500 years and then you slice that 500 years 7 different ways. And I don't think we'll get to all 7 in the hour that we have, but I'm hoping we can do some of them, because what I found reading the book is if I take each chapter as a slice of 500 years from a different lens, by the time I got to chapter 4, 5, 6, you've kind of read the same, like you kind of have the furniture in the room already. You kind of know what's happening, but then you're looking from a different angle. And this was I thought it was a really fantastic way to approach studying the emergence of the Christian movement, or I should say Christianities, because that was an important part of the book. Can we start with the first slice? The first slice of the first chapter in the book is called The Idea of Israel. And this chapter traces the sort of evolution of how Christianity could go from being a movement about a Jewish Messiah to a movement that had deep problems with its Jewish origins and a lot of anti-Semitism. Could you start us off just to set the scene with what the situation was kind of at the birth of Christianity? What was the situation around the Mediterranean for Jewish communities? And how did God end up speaking Greek was also an important part of that chapter.
God starts speaking Greek a few centuries before the century that sees the birth of Christianities. It's the Jewish scriptures are translated from Hebrew and a little bit of Aramaic into Greek by Jews in Alexandria. This is after the conquest of Alexander the Great, where Greek spread abroad and became the English of antiquity. So this means that the Jewish population living in the Western diaspora, the edge of the Mediterranean up to Italy and Spain and North Africa, were speaking Greek and had access to their books in Greek. This is an important thing because it meant that Jewish traditions were available to a much larger readership or hearership, I should say. People most often have texts read to them in antiquity. But this meant that Jewish traditions could be broadcast on an international frequency. And the way that would happen, the nodes of communication in the Western diaspora were the Jewish communities themselves that would organize. And we use synagogue as a catch-all term for this, but they could use many different words that means assembly or congregation. And one of the aspects of Jewish culture seems to have been that there was a community meeting once every 7 days, which made it somewhat unusual in Greco-Roman antiquity. And it's in that context that ancestral traditions would be read aloud and discussed. And what most people, my students are always surprised to find out that there were no hard and fast borders between Jewish communities and the Greco-Roman cities that the Jews were living in, and that pagans were not that rarely included in these types of meetings. So there was a pagan knowledge of Jewish traditions and of the Jewish God. And we know this, for example, from magical recipes, where you can find garbled biblical stories being invoked to get the magic to work. And this is probably from magicians with a professional interest. You always want a powerful God to help you with your spell. Picking up some stuff from Jewish traditions that they would have heard in these communities. So these people, these Jewishly affiliated pagans, are sometimes referred to in inscriptions and in literature as God-fearers. And the Acts of the Apostles, which is a story about Christian origins that's part of the New Testament, has God-fearers in synagogue communities as kind of a routine thing. So this is where you get the points of contact between Jews and pagans.
Those people become sort of the place where this new religion, if I could call it that, can spread. Can you give us a bird's eye view of how the shift happened over 300-400 years, that this movement began around a Jewish Messiah could become so anti-Jewish? I know this is a lot to ask in one question, but can you talk through a little bit about some of the broad kind of shapes of that movement? Because it's fascinating how it evolves through the centuries to the point where Christianity could disavow those kind of origins around Judaism, or baptize Pilate, or blame the Jews for the crucifixion, things like that. How did that trajectory happen?
Christian anti-Judaism is, in a way, born over an argument about how to interpret texts, Greek texts. And part of the argument is about how to interpret the Septuagint, which is the term for the Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures. Part of it has to do with the arguments that shape a lot of Jewish tradition, which is about the right way to be Jewish. And Moses is always nudging the children of Israel to behave in a certain way. The prophets are complaining about them. David laments a lack of loyalty on the part. So there are negative, self-critical aspects in Jewish scriptures. And I think that it's against that wallpaper that we should put the Gospels, which at this particular moment in academic time are being looked at as themselves forms of late Second Temple Judaism. So the authors of the canonical Gospels are themselves probably Jews. And a lot of what we look at as anti-Jewish language in those Gospels is part of this language of self-criticism. And particularly with the Passion narratives, which will go on to have a long and horrible history in terms of Jewish-Christian relations, that seems to be born of the necessity to explain why the temple is destroyed in the year 70. The Gospels tell a story about Jesus set historically around the year 30, but the Gospels themselves seem to have been composed in the period after the destruction of the temple, from sometime between 70 and 100, according to academic consensus. And that means they have to explain why the God of the universe allowed his temple to be destroyed. And one of the narrative explanations in the gospel stories is that it's because the priests rejected Jesus, that God, in a sense, rejects the priests by destroying the temple. Now, once that story is taken out of its original ethnic context, in a way, and read by outsiders, it becomes an indictment of all Jews, and that becomes a particularly vicious stream of Christian anti-Judaism, to the point where, as you mentioned, Tertullian, a 2nd, 3rd century church father, has Pilate as a Christian, in his secret heart already a Christian. And that happens by around the year 200. So there's a rehabilitation of Rome, which takes work, because historically the only power that would have had the authority to order a crucifixion would have been a Roman authority. And yet the Roman authorities are released from responsibility for the crucifixion, and it's increasingly put on the Jews. And that, I think, is the kernel of a lot of what will become Christian anti-Judaism.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And maybe those 3rd century Christians could identify a little more with Pilate than with the chief priest by that point, because you have a thoroughly Roman religion and they're just not really, it's a little bit of a foreign world to them, I imagine.
For sure.
Yeah. One of the things that struck me as I was reading this chapter is it's interesting that Christianity retained any connection to Judaism at all. When you have people in the 2nd century, like Marcion, for example, trying to completely almost remove this connection. But the proto-Orthodox movement did swing back towards kind of a Jewish, like retaining that Jewish kernel. Do you have a sense of like why that is, or what that was about? I think it's really interesting, because you could imagine a different version of Christianity that just becomes completely no influence, no Hebrew Bible, no anything. It's just a separate religious movement.
Well, in fact, we do know that's what's so amazing about the second century is this laboratory for different types of Christianities. I think that the stream of Christianity that will prevail is attached to has the Jewish connection, if you will,
Hmm.
partly because of the prestige of these ancient Jewish texts in antiquity. Antiquity is a place where older is better. Homer's better, right? The Genesis is better. Moses is old. There are arguments over who's older. Moses or the Greek philosophers and so on. So there's a prestige to this collection of books. And Marcion is really brave to try and sever those connections, because a lot of the burden of early Christian texts, for Paul, for example, Paul's letters, is that the God who is supposed to be worshipped is specifically the God of Israel.
Hmm.
So there's almost a genetic connection in that sense, which is continued in part of the proto-Orthodox stream.
Yeah. There's a really nice segue to the second chapter as we keep moving through. The second chapter is called The Dilemmas of Diversity, and it's exactly this, on how there were all these different streams within the Christian movement, or the Christianities. I pulled a quote out of your second chapter that said, "The enemy of orthodoxy is time." I thought that's a really great way to say it. Can you talk a little bit about some of the movements that emerged in the second century? We already mentioned Marcion. Maybe talk, for those who may not know, because some of my listeners may not, talk a little bit about Marcion or Valentinus or some of these different diverse Christian streams that emerged, and different reinterpretations of what Paul had to say or what Jesus had to say.
Three of the second century theologians that are often compared with each other, and they wouldn't have liked being in the same elevator with each other, are Valentinus, who is known as a Gnostic thinker, somebody who reads the Jewish text in Greek, and generates very creative and imaginative stories about the origins of the universe and how Christ fits into a program of redemption. And what's interesting with Valentinus is that he is thinking philosophically as well as reading these scriptures. And thinking philosophically, the highest God in Platonic forms of philosophy is a God who is radically transcendent, completely perfect, unmoving. That's part of his perfection. And you have complications when you look at Genesis, because the first thing God does in the Hebrew Bible is start doing things. That's how we meet him in Genesis. So what Valentinus does is develop a whole backstory of what's going on in the upper cosmos that eventually leads to a trickle-down effect where material reality is brought into existence. And the God of this lower material reality is the God of Genesis. So that's something that's not that familiar to most modern Christians, but it was completely coherent as one way of looking at it. And Valentinus moves from Alexandria to Rome. Another Christian who moves from Alexandria to Rome in the mid-second century is Marcion. He comes from the region of the Black Sea. He also moves to Rome, and he also has this complicated relationship with Jewish scriptures, where it's the lower God of the physical cosmos that's the God of Israel, and it's the higher God who is the Father of Christ. And instead of taking this in the direction that Valentinus did, of having these elaborate reinterpretations of Jewish scripture, Marcion said, let the Jews keep those books. We're going to have our own collection. And the collection that Marcion sponsors is a grouping of the letters of Paul, and one form of the gospel that might have been the original form of the gospel that he was familiar with, the Gospel of Luke. And he says that this should be the scriptural base of Christian worship. And again, because of this model of a higher God and a lower God, Marcion is condemned by the proto-Orthodox, but his idea of a New Testament has a long future. And you think of our modern New Testaments, it still has this architecture of gospel plus letters. And that comes out of Marcion. And the third Christian theologian is Justin Martyr, who comes from Neapolis in modern-day Israel and ends up also in Rome. That right there, Alexandria, the Black Sea, and what is then called Syria, Palestina, lets you know of how much this movement has spread in ex-pagan populations already by the mid-2nd century. Justin says, no, you're reading the Septuagint all wrong. And the God that's actually doing all those things, he has the same definition of the high God as Marcion and Valentinus. So he says, so what is he going to do with this busy God in the Jewish scriptures? He says, aha, that God is actually the Son of God before his incarnation. And he calls Jesus quite freely a heteros theos, another God, as long as it's a lower God and a higher God, as long as there's a theological hierarchy, this idea of philosophical monotheism is preserved. So Justin radically Christianizes the Jewish texts in Greek to have them be a coded story for the coming of Justin's own Gentile church. And the problem with the Jews, says Justin, is that they don't know how to read their own scriptures. They should be reading that according to the Spirit, the way Justin does, and not according to the flesh, which is the way Jews read their own scriptures, says Justin. So this is already a fight that's going on just in Rome and taking place in Greek. But there are all other forms of Christianity that are going eastward. There are Jewish forms of Christianity. There are forms of Christianity we can't tell if they're Jewish or Gentile. So it means there's a retrospective selection of what we look at as Christian origins, and that's those origins that matter to the West.
I love that you used the word coherent for each of these, because I think it's something people miss, is that in the 2nd century, these people are rapidly trying to come up with, these theological systems, none of which are obvious, none of which are just a given, none of which were given by the apostles or anything like that, which is kind of the later Orthodox story that gets told. Each of these is logically coherent in their own way. And I think we miss that with heresiology, that we often don't understand that, like, all of these people, their worldviews were perfectly coherent to them and to a number of their followers. Is that fair?
That's absolutely true. And another reason why it seems the heresies can seem, quote, incoherent is because one of the most Jewish things about this movement is that everybody's yelling, all these Gentile Christians are yelling at each other about the right way to be a Christian. And the rhetoric, what should I call agonistic rhetoric, the rhetoric of struggle, gives a description of the enemy that isn't meant to be a description. It's meant to be a caricature, because what you're doing is presenting the strongest case for your own form of Christianity. So the other side is incoherent, secretly sexually profligate, communing with demons, diseased, and so on. And that's the rhetoric that gets preserved in proto-Orthodox writers and sanctioned in the 4th century with Constantine.
And I was going to say effeminate too. That was a really interesting part of that chapter, is talking about how there's a lot of gendered accusations within these kind of heresiological accusations.
That's right. Well, they're drawing on a longer tradition of classical writers' ethnographies, where Greek and Roman writers, historians, and ethnographers would look at non-Greek or non-Roman civilizations and ethnicities and kind of present them as negatively as possible to make their own group look good. So, for example, if you were a Greek, then you said terrible things about the Persians. And one of the things you would say about the Persians is that they were effeminate. And then if you're a Roman, the Greeks become effeminate, right? So putting a group down as effeminate is one of the stock insults of Greco-Roman learning. And that's something that's completely adopted by these Christians who are fighting with each other.
That's really interesting. We're going to come back to some more stuff on gender later in the later chapters. But the one other question I wanted to ask about this chapter, it's interesting. And I think what you've just given us helps us contextualize something that is happening. And this is the writing of Pseudepigrapha. So we have all of these sort of writings, and this is something, I mean, I do a lot of education on early Christian writings, and it's hard for us, I think, as moderns to understand pseudepigrapha. There's a lot of people really are resistant to the fact that if this says it was written by Paul or Peter, then we should give that the benefit of the doubt because the church fathers knew what was happening. But in this context, it really helps us understand how beneficial it could be with all of these, people in this agonistic struggle for survival or to come out on top. Why it would be really nice to have somebody like Paul giving some kind of credence to your thoughts. Is that a fair assessment?
Right. Paul, there are a lot of Acts of the Apostles that were the adventures of the apostles that are written in the 2nd and 3rd century. Paul becomes an expert missionary and an exemplary celibate in the Acts of Paul and Thecla, a great equivalent of a road trip movie from antiquity. The pseudepigrapha, there are also, pseudepigraphy means false writing, right? And there's a lot of the letters attributed to Paul that are in the New Testament collection are written by people who are writing in Paul's name and claiming to be Paul. Why are they doing that? It's a way to authorize what they're saying. So it's an index of Paul's importance. It's a measure of the plasticity of tradition, which is why orthodoxy's enemy is time. I mean, things keep changing as they grow. And the pastoral epistles are written probably after Marcion, against Marcion, but they eventually get incorporated into the Orthodox New Testament. So pseudepigraphy in a manuscript culture is one of the easiest things in the world to affect. In fact, one of the pseudepigraphical Pauline epistles, 2 Thessalonians, says, don't be disturbed if you read a letter that seems like it comes from me. And that's exactly what the author is doing.
Yeah, like get out in front of it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Okay, slice number 3. We're moving right along here. We're going to cover 500 years of Christianities and no. I think people need to hear this kind of bird's eye view sometimes. I think as scholars, we so often get caught up in the weeds, and the weeds are interesting, but it's really nice to take these big slices and think in these big pictures. So chapter 3 is about persecution and martyrdom. And one of the real revelations of this chapter for me, and it was so obvious when I thought about it, but you have the common idea of early Christian persecution, but we don't really get a sense that a lot of these early persecutions were people being persecuted because they were Christian. More likely, sometimes incidental, sometimes maybe like locally, but we have a lot of different reasons. And one of the things that struck me that you talk about in the chapter is how often in these martyrdom stories of church fathers, or well, not only fathers, but I was thinking the martyrdom of Polycarp, for example, you have the idea of Christians going along to watch, which you think you wouldn't be allowed to go watch somebody's martyrdom if you're also in hiding and at risk of being, persecuted for your beliefs. So could you talk a little bit about what early Christian persecution was? Maybe it's not even right to say early Christian persecution, but what those quote unquote persecutions were about and how we can understand them in this context.
Well, Christianity has a persecution complex, right? If you're persecuted, you're righteous. I mean, if you're suffering, it's a form of theodicy. If you're suffering, it doesn't mean God's abandoned you. It means that in a sense, God's chosen you and you're the righteous one. And the figure of Christ is a model for that with the crucifixion. And eventually there'll be stories about the apostles where all of them end up as martyrs. And one of the reasons there is an overdevelopment of the idea of martyrdom in Christianity is because of the evolution of the cult of the dead, where the bodies of people who are thought to have been killed by the Roman state have what we might call magical qualities. And so relics become incredibly important, and you can't have a relic unless you have a martyr. So you have a proliferation of martyrdoms. The martyrdom is looked at as a type of literature that's meant to instill a certain kind of clarity to Christian identity. And it's a story of conflict, and it's very black and white. And what's interesting, one of the interesting things about this is you get the greatest proliferation of martyr stories after the conversion of Constantine, which is a way for the Imperial Church, which is busy persecuting Christian heretics, now called heretics, to appropriate and create a heroic past for itself. But a 3rd century church father, Origen of Alexandria, noted in one of his writings around the 240s that not many had died for the Christian name. He's saying that in 240. So this idea of a universal persecution is something that we owe to later developments of later Christianity, and also to Hollywood, of course.
Yeah, and you mentioned, so in the book you talk about a few little pockets that are famous. Maybe could we talk about Nero? Like that's one famous one. A lot of people think like Nero led a mass persecution of Christians. Can you kind of contextualize that one for us?
Nero was in an awkward position in the year 64 because most of the city of Rome burned down. And in order to deflect blame for the catastrophe, he focused on this. He focused on a group that will later be known as Christians. It's Tacitus and Suetonius who talk about this. Tacitus and Suetonius are 2 pagan Roman historians from the turn of the 1st into the 2nd century who are looking back and saying these people are Christian, and the Christians are blamed but they're not being persecuted as Christians. They're being persecuted as arsonists. Nero is blaming these people for having set the fire. In other words, if there hadn't been a fire, there wouldn't have been a Neronian persecution. But Nero is this one of the emperors that everybody loves to hate. It's sort of like Caligula and Nero. And so Nero has this horrible reputation anyway, and he becomes a figure like the Antichrist in Christian tradition, partly on the merit of his scapegoating this population in the year 64. And it's specific to the city of Rome.
Interesting. And then there's another example from this chapter that jumped out at me was the later story. I forget which emperor it was, but the empire is in a bad spot. The city of Rome is struggling, and the emperor demands sort of universal sacrifice to the gods as a sort of like let's all get in on this together and make sure we're really really being as pious as possible. And this is the point where we have some Christians refuse, some actually do take part in sacrifices and find other ways around, find ways to do their diligence with the Roman Empire while maintaining their Christian identity. Can you talk a little bit about that moment? That I found that a really interesting story too.
That moment is specific to the year 250. It's the Emperor Decius.
Right.
The empire had been on the ropes. Every border had collapsed. There was runaway inflation. There was a plague. I mean, it was a bad job being the emperor at that point. Before this, in the year 212, another emperor had declared all free residents of the empire to be citizens of Rome. So that spread the idea of Roman citizenship from the city to the empire as a whole, which meant that you had certain obligations as a Roman, whether you lived now in Alexandria or in Nablus or in Jerusalem or in any place. So this call for everybody to do what they could to get heaven back on Rome's side was something that had to do with the concept of being Roman. And we know from the consequences of this action that many Christians did go along with this because they saw themselves as Romans as well as of Christians. And other people, you got it was such a bureaucratic mess because there'd never been any coordinated effort to have everybody on the same page religiously before. And tax forms were adopted to certify that somebody had paid the respect to the Roman gods so that the empire would be protected by heaven again. It's called a libellus. And people who got them somehow, whether they bribed officials for them or they sent a proxy for it, were called libellatici, people who got a libellus. And we know from sermons that a lot of the bishops, some bishops went along with this too. Other bishops are trying to tell these people that they're lapsed And there's the invention of protocols for penance that are born in this period in order to reintegrate the lapsed back into the church. And so that gives you a measure of, a refusal to become a martyr, in a sense, on the part of a lot of Christians.
Yeah. But you mentioned at one point that there are actually Christians at this point who are priests in the imperial cult.
Well, yes, there's that.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that.
That's post-Constantine is when that really becomes shocking.
Okay.
That it is a cult of the Christian emperor as well. And the Christian emperor is considered this person who has a special relationship with heaven on the part of the empire. And he's called divus, divine, once he's dead. And we have a letter from Constantine to a town in Italy that wanted to start a cult to Constantine and his family. And they were so proud of getting this email from Constantine that they inscribed it on stone. Good thing for us.
Yeah.
And what we have is Constantine saying, okay, you can have gladiators and you can have this and you can have this many priests, but no blood sacrifices, please. Okay. So the cult of the emperor goes on awkwardly enough after 312.
That's really interesting. So speaking of Constantine, you mention in the book that the longest and most effective period of Christian persecution began under Constantine. That would be, I think, a surprise to a lot of people. Can we unpack that? You kind of hinted at it a minute ago, but let's go a little deeper on that, because I think it's really, really interesting that most people would not think of this, that this is when serious Christian persecution began.
Serious government persecution of Christians. Once the government becomes involved with Christianity, one of the first jobs Constantine has to do is decide which church. Remember, there are all these different types of Christianities. Which church is going to be the one that Constantine acknowledges as the right one? Why does he have to be concerned about which church is the right one? Because you want heaven to be on your side. Government is a form of religious activity and antiquity. And so it's very important governmentally to sponsor the right type of religion. And Constantine, what's he going to do? He turns to bishops and says, which one of you is the right one? And of course, everybody says, well, I am. But he ends up going with one particular group, which gets his patronage and protection. And what happens is, because of the enterprising bishops who are sponsored now by the imperial government, they get to say, well, this guy over here is a heretic. And Constantine says, okay, he's exiled, he's out of town. Or, oh, good, that means I can take over his church building, which meant that there were church buildings before the conversion of Constantine. So how persecuted could Christianity have been, right? So there's a benefit of taking over the property of people who are now called heretics. And it's not called persecution. This activity is called disciplining. It's disciplining heretics to get them to go to the real church. And what's the real church? It's a church that the emperor sponsors. So it's in this context that you get a much more focused effort to get everybody on the same page. And that leads to a much greater number of persecutions of Christians, but they're considered deviant Christians by the government. But a much greater persecution of Christians after the conversion of Constantine than before.
Wow. And one of the things, I'm going to jump forward a few chapters now because these questions are tied closely together in my brain. I was interested to learn how much Constantine revitalized or revolutionized the economy to be closely integrated with church discipline, church hierarchy. That essentially the church became an instrument of Constantine's economy and had a lot of control that way too. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, one of the benefits of being emperors, you have access to all this cash. And one of the ways, a traditional Mediterranean way of showing patronage is to give benefits. And the benefits of being in the right ecclesiastical hierarchy in Constantine's period is that he would share imperial largesse with these bishops, who then in their own cities would become very important patrons, because they had, by having access to wealth, they had access to power. They could feed the poor.
Hmm.
They could build impressive buildings. Constantine melts down some pagan statuary and uses that precious metal, for to sponsor these Christian populations. So you have a kind of webbing, an economic webbing, that in turn reinforces Orthodox hierarchy. And meanwhile, the Orthodox hierarchy is praising Constantine. So you have this nice feedback system between the emperor and the bishops.
When we think of Constantine as the Christian, and there's a story about him converting, a famous story about him seeing the cross, and the cross said vision that says, "By this sign conquer." In your book, you allude to the fact that Constantine may have been a less than very committed Christian and may have only really converted on his deathbed. We talk a little bit about what kind of a man he was and his relationship to Christianity. Was it a deep piety that drove him to all these things?
Again, given the plasticity of Christian identity in antiquity, it's not that he was a bad Christian. He was a certain type of Christian. And as emperor, he isn't going to go after absolutely everybody. He's trying to get the trains to run on time and keep domestic peace. But he's particularly, it's much worse to be a Christian than to be a pagan or a Jew. With Constantine's power, because what he's really focused on is purging the church of heretics. The fact that he's still Pontifex Maximus, which means greatest priest, which was an imperial title that goes back to Augustus, meant that he's responsible for all religio in the empire, to make sure that it's going according to plan. So does that make him a naughty Christian? Well, it does, by the measure of these absolutist definitions of Christian identity. But in fact, his flexibility doesn't mean he wasn't sincere. It means that that's the type of Christian he was. He has unfortunate, it's a tough job being an emperor. He probably murdered his wife. He probably murdered his son. He definitely murdered one of his rivals and the rival's 9-year-old son. In his consolidation of power. And it was probably a smart move on his part to put off baptism until he was on his deathbed. The trick is to repent the day before you die.
Yeah, right. And I guess, is this to do with, I didn't put this together, but this is to do with post-baptismal sin? Like, at this point, you were supposed to not sin after you're baptized? Is that the idea?
Well,
Baptism
is such a great occasion. It's probably the most sinless you'll ever be. Right. And that's it's out of an excess of caution that people will do. This happened with Augustine, and he was raised by a very ferociously Christian mother, and he falls ill as a young adolescent, or like 12, 13 something. He falls ill and he begs to be baptized, and Monica doesn't want him baptized because she wants him to have a political career. So that's how baptism is configured.
That's smart, I think. I think that's really shrewd use of baptism. So Constantine's kind of revolution doesn't completely last. It starts to be undone a little bit by Julian, who comes after him, and then ultimately, again, the empire swings back towards Christianity. Can you talk about that transformation and evolution?
Constantine's largesse was something that in the long run wasn't economically viable. And what you get with his heirs is an effort to dial back some of the economic benefits. And then what happens is a descendant of Constantine's, Julian, who is a cradle Christian, whose Constantine's sons had murdered the males of Julian's family because they didn't want any confusions around the issue of dynastic succession. And Julian is raised a Christian, and he becomes a philosophy major in Athens, and secretly goes back to worshiping the traditional gods. And remember, this is in the 350s. The empire hasn't been Christian for that long. And so when Julian eventually ascends to the purple and becomes a sole emperor, he completely comes out as a pagan. Oops. He shuts off the spigot with this economic patronizing of this episcopal network. And he really knew his Christianity very well. And what he does is try to reformat paganism, which is this big, baggy, locally specific forms of Mediterranean spirituality. He tries to get them to be a kind of international priesthood with a hierarchical structure and everything. In other words, it's a Christianized bureaucratic model he tries to assert on paganism. And again, because he knows his Christianity, Julian decides he wants to rebuild the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Because the prophecy in the Gospels that there would be, remember, the Gospels are written after the destruction of the temple. Jesus says in Mark 13, there will be no stone upon another that will not be thrown down. And that the destruction of the temple was pointed to by Christians saying we're right and Jews are wrong for centuries. And what Julian wants to do is embarrass that tradition by having a stone put upon another. What the Jews thought about a pagan emperor building their temple, we have no record of. But it comes to naught because Julian dies on campaign in Persia. And the next successor is a Christian again. And it's Christians all the way down after that.
That's funny. Yeah, I mean, you could maybe to some extent that became the prophecy stayed fulfilled now, now that the temple didn't get rebuilt. I was laughing when I was reading this chapter. I'm sorry, I'm jumping around in the book a little bit, but trying to go with the flow of the conversation. I was laughing when I was reading the chapter on Christ and Empire, hearing about the interplay between Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, and Theodosius, and the sort of fighting back and forth, and the amount of time that I was waiting. I don't know this history very well, and I was really fully expecting Theodosius to throw Ambrose in prison or something, but he doesn't. Could you tell that story? Just fascinating, the interplay there between, I guess you could say maybe church and state or something, but it's really interesting.
States aren't born yet, and churches are at the, in some sense, at the beck and call of the emperor, but Ambrose himself is a Roman aristocrat. He has no problem with the exercise of power. And he has a political reach on Theodosius because Theodosius has to go to Ambrose, the bishop, if he wants to receive sacraments. And so when Theodosius is in town, Ambrose is in Milan. And Theodosius had... there was an issue about a Jewish synagogue that had been destroyed by Christians who had been whipped up by their local bishop. This happens in the eastern part of the empire. And Theodosius, who's a ferocious Christian, rules that the bishop had to pay restitution to the Jewish community because, again, as bishop, as emperor, emperors don't like civic unrest. They don't like random destruction. The bishop is ordered to pay damages, basically, to the Jewish community, since he was the reason the Jewish community had lost their building. Ambrose flips out about this. He says, how can you possibly do this? You absolutely can't. Jews are bad. They're cursed. You shouldn't do this. How dare you humiliate and Theodosius says, oh, okay, and backs down. There's another episode where there's an unfortunate urban unrest in Greece, and a lot of civilians are butchered. And Theodosius, who had been sort of behind that initiative because of it had been a way of discouraging unrest in this particular city. And Ambrose demands that he make a public penance. And Ambrose, a lot of it must do with his personality.
Yeah.
He was incredibly commanding, but he also had this, in a sense, a magic wand. He was the only one who could give a sacrament. And Theodosius would have lost imperial credibility if he weren't aligned with the church. So you get this back and forth seesaw of power and prestige. I mean, the emperor is still on top in one way. The emperor is in control of the army, but Ambrose is in control of the sacraments. And that's why Milan has this fabulous face-off between the two of them.
Yeah. There was a story where they barricade themselves in the cathedral as well.
That's right. There's the Western emperor who's living in Milan is sort of more sympathetic to a form of Orthodox Christianity that isn't quite Orthodox anymore. It's called Arianism. And the Goths who were part of the Roman army wanted to have their own liturgy in their own church building, and there are cathedrals in Milan. And so the emperor says, okay, give up one of your cathedrals and let my Gothic soldiers use it. And Ambrose, again, around with whom one does not mess,
Yeah.
it says he's willing to be a martyr. He's not giving up any real estate. He and his congregation barricade themselves in the church in question. And the emperor backs down. He's not going to be seen to butcher. He could have, but of course he couldn't, to butcher a Christian population. So again, that's another situation where had the Bishop of Milan had a different personality, we wouldn't have these wonderful stories to tell.
He must, yeah. I mean, it must have just been quite an imposing figure. And then you hear, like Augustine was quite taken by him, and he's famously has an important role in Augustine's life and journey too. But that's just all so interesting. I really enjoyed reading all these kind of little tidbits that I didn't know about. I want to take us back in time, back 500 years, I guess, to do another kind of slice, because I think one of the fascinating things about Christianities is how the end has been understood. You get the beginning of a movement that expects, under Paul, expects the imminent return of Christ in his lifetime. And there's a constant negotiation, it seems, through the centuries of Christians waiting for the end, and sometimes doing wild things like selling all their possessions and going out into the desert, things like that. But then institutionally recognizing that for stability, there needs to be a tamping down of some of that end times fervor. And I grew up as an evangelical kid in the 90s, so a lot of this sounded kind of almost familiar to me. But can you talk a little bit about this interplay of how the end was, the apocalyptic stuff played so prominently in early Christianity, but then it was ultimately sort of, I guess, brought under the control of the empire?
Well, if you think of what medieval churches look like, where you have Christ in majesty at the very portal of the cathedral with heaven and hell depicted on there, that's a way that apocalyptic eschatology, this expectation of an imminent end, is domesticated by turning into a focus on where your soul or body and soul go after death, to one place or the other. The expectation of Christ coming back was hardwired for Paul to the experience of the resurrection. What the resurrection meant is that God's kingdom was about to be in place, or else Christ wouldn't have been raised. So the resurrection automatically implies that he'll come back. What is Christ going to do? He's going to defeat the pagan gods and establish the kingdom of God. There'll be a resurrection of the dead. And all those who are saved are going to ascend up to heaven. It's a geocentric universe, and people will ascend where the commonwealth of the Christian is, he says in one of his letters. So there's that expectation, and it's part of the genetic material of Christianity. It's in formative Christian texts. And what you get is situational stimulations of this expectation: an earthquake, an eclipse, an outburst of plague, the threat of war. All of those could be looked at as signs of the approaching end. And nobody's been right yet about reading these signs. But I remember during the first Gulf War, there was a lot of buzz about Jesus coming back because it was a power from the north raining fire down upon Israel. I mean, it fit the biblical template of prophecy so effortlessly.
Yeah.
And in, I think, 2010, the Pew Foundation interviewed American Christians, 47% of which expect Christ to come back in the year 2050. So this is an evergreen prophecy.
Yeah.
And I bet after 2050, there'll still be people saying, "Well, it'll definitely happen." Yeah.
Well, I was amazed at how many times, because you trace all these different moments where people are like, okay, like it's the year 200 or whatever. Now it's going to be coming now. So the calendar obviously plays part of the obsession, but it's this kind of mixture that almost, I think you point to Augustine as somebody who says after the fall of Rome and all of the failed prophecies, basically says like, we really got to quit this now. It's like, maybe it's time to start thinking.
Just relax. Just dial it back. Although, again, one of the ways that apocalyptic expectation is domesticated is that intellectuals, Christian theologians, devise this idea of the millennial week, where the earth is going to last for 6,000 years, and in the year 6,000, Christ will come back. Well, the year 6,000 since the birth of the world coincides with what we think of. Nobody's dating Anno Domini in this period, but it coincides with sometime in a zone between 400 and 500. And that's exactly when the barbarian invasions crumbled the Western Empire. So it really did seem like the end of the world. We saw this in the year 1000 with European history, and we certainly saw it in the year 2000 as well. Big round numbers stimulate millennial expectations.
It's so funny. And I mean, the calendar dates are in some ways very arbitrary, but it's still interesting how these numbers are so powerful for our psyche sometimes.
Well, it gives you a kind of grip on it. It lets you know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
It's always good to know what the future is going to bring. And this gives you a scientific way of knowing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good hard number.
There's a verse, I think it's in 2 Peter, where it says, like, in the last days, there will be scoffers who say, where's the promise of his coming? And I remember reading this verse as a kid and still feeling the power in that, is like, people have said, those scoffers who think he's not coming again, when he comes, they're going to be sorry, kind of thing. So.
Well, it's proof. The fact that they're scoffing is proof that it's about to happen.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it kind of builds in this whole defense complex right into the literature.
Right. It becomes non-falsifiable.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I want to go. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I'd love to talk about asceticism, because I think this is a really fascinating thread in the Christian movement. It would ultimately lead to church structure. There's a lot in here about kind of female empowerment that around asceticism that was cracked down on. But could you start by talking a little bit about maybe what asceticism is? We see a resistance maybe to sex in Paul, as early as Paul, and it becomes central to Christian movements like Marcion or Valentinus. Can you give us a kind of bird's eye view of what asceticism is and the role it played in those first few centuries?
Asceticism ascesis is a kind of discipline, and it focuses on food, sleep, and sex. And there has been in pagan culture and in Jewish culture periodic movements that have incorporated asceticism into it. Philosophers thought that that you should only have sex for the purpose of procreation, or the true philosopher doesn't have sex at all. It's a pagan idea. You have alternate periods of sexual activity and sexual abstinence within Jewish marriage. That's part of the biblical laws. And what you get in Paul, who I think of as a late Second Temple Jew, is this idea that because the kingdom of God is about to come, it's better to concentrate on prayer than to be involved with family life. This is in 1 Corinthians 7. And he says, why? The form of this world is passing away. So it's better that you not be distracted by having to get the kids to school and making lunches or any of that other stuff, and concentrate on prayer. And one good way to do this is not have sexual relations within marriage, or better yet, as Paul said, I wish that all were as I myself am. He has no self-esteem issues. And he
apparently no libido.
He suggests that people be celibate, but as he's not telling people to stop breathing. He's telling them just to hold their breath. because the kingdom is coming. When the kingdom doesn't come, that text has to change its meaning.
Yeah.
And it becomes a timeless kind of injunction of what the better way to be, what the true way to be a true Christian is. And this kind of radical asceticism is something that blooms really starting in the 3rd and 4th centuries, where you get people dedicated to having a kind of regulated discipline. You get the birth of the monastery. You also have wild, charismatic groups of mixed men and women who are celibate, who are also itinerant, walking around. We tend not to hear that much about them because they were an embarrassment to the church. You have women who are shaving their hair off, becoming men for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And you get imperial legislation against women who cut off their hair because it's seen as gender confusion, which the church doesn't like. So it's this big burst of discipline. And meanwhile, if you look at the sermons, the bishops are yelling at men in their congregations who are still having sex with their slaves, not to mention their wives.
Yeah.
You get a church canon law that talks about people beating their slaves to death. If it happens by accident, then you only go without sacraments for 5 years. If you do it on purpose, you go without sacraments for 7 years. So there's, at the same time, the sermons and the canonical laws give you one sense of society. If you read just the literature of the ascetic heroes, you'd be amazed that there are generations we still can count on now, right?
Yeah. Yeah. In the 2nd century, the Marcion, we already mentioned these movements, but Marcion, Valentinus, asceticism plays a part in each of those movements as well. And you already mentioned the famous Acts of Paul and Thecla. We get literature that celebrates asceticism. What's the context of that? What's that 2nd century look like?
Well, it's partly with Marcion, it's certainly with the authority of Paul and what Paul says, but it's also this idea that really dedicated people don't have sex. And for Marcion, to be a baptized member of his community, you really had to be celibate. This is also an idea in another form of Christianity, Manichaeism, where if you're going to be part of the upper hierarchy, you're not going to be married, you're not going to have sexual relations. It also becomes, with quite a bit of struggle, one of the measures of commitment for Catholic priesthood as well. The idea that sex is somehow something that compromises your spirituality. This is already abroad in the 2nd century, and the Acts of Paul and Thecla are a wonderful story about this, about a young girl who listens to Paul preach about celibacy and decides to break off her engagement, and which really annoys her mother and her fiance.
Yeah.
And she ends up going off and getting on the road and ending up in Antioch. And she's, of course, beautiful, or there wouldn't be a story. And so another hot pagan guy tries to make a move on Thecla, and she says no, and she has to go to the arena, and she's about to be devoured by wild seals, the text says. And I always pictured it as like SeaWorld. What do they do? Roll in a glass, pool full of seals. And how do you kill somebody with seals in a Roman arena? Anyway,
maybe it's a miss. Maybe it's a corruption in the text or something.
She survives. She finds Paul again, and Paul says, basically his own version of "go and make disciples of all nations." And she hits the road herself as a Christian missionary, which is, again, really unusual for a text that, this text drove Tertullian crazy because he didn't think women should have this type of role. Yeah. And he tells a story that the Acts of Paul and Thecla were actually written by a presbyter who got too enthusiastic about Paul, but it's a wildly popular book. There are stories of apocryphal Acts of the Apostles where there'll be a high society wedding, and all of a sudden one of these apostles, Thomas, will show up and give a long lecture on the benefits of celibacy to the young married couple who decide to, all right, fine, Robin Lane Fox, a historian, said that of all the guests at a high society wedding, an apocryphal apostle was the worst.
That's hilarious. Oh my God. So you get a pushback then. Actually, let's go here first. One of the things that struck me as I was reading this chapter is how much asceticism can kind of be empowering of maybe subaltern groups or empowering of women in particular. You already mentioned, but I'd love you to talk a bit more about these movements that women played a big part, or sometimes it's men and women mixed, but they're wandering around. They're sometimes having these like charismatic experiences, to which the church eventually needs to control, which we can talk about in a second. But can you talk first about what those movements, a little bit more about what they may have looked like? Because it's really, I think a lot of people would be surprised, as you already said, to know that this kind of stuff was happening.
Well, in terms of female empowerment, prophecy is also a way that women become empowered. There's a movement that will eventually be known as Montanism. It was known as the New Prophecy, and where the Holy Spirit descended upon two women and a man in a part of Asia Minor, and they were prophesying the coming of the kingdom and having, again, what prophecy does is give you a kind of authority if you're not condemned for having it. There are women who begin to have ecstatic experiences and who are sworn to celibacy, and that is destabilizing. So they'll be condemned and roped in. On the other hand, you have church mothers as well as church fathers being organizing monastic communities in the Egyptian desert. Right. On the third hand, you have all these stories about female ascetics who have to be in drag. They pretend they're men, and it's only once they're dead that the community discovers and is shocked to find out that they were women all along. So is that an endorsement of feminine empowerment? I don't think so. Yeah, so again, it's a multivocal tradition.
Yeah, that's fascinating. But the church needs to crack down. And when we read something like in 1 Timothy about how the episcopos should be a husband of one wife, I never clued into this. I always thought this was like more talking about like polygamy or something, but it's actually maybe going the other way and encouraging that you should actually have a wife. So there's an attempt to put back this kind of I don't know, the word stability has a lot of judgment, but this kind of church authority that goes along with these gender hierarchies. Can you talk about that kind of counter attempt?
Well, sure. I mean, you have in Augustine's period, you have bishops who are the sons of other bishops. I mean, you have ecclesiastical marriage for a long time. I think it takes till the 12th century before the church finally is able to fully enforce celibacy. And of course, with Renaissance popes, that's out the window again.
Wasn't there a famous pope who said that papacy should be hereditary? I think I remember that. I forget who it was.
It was. It was. But so you have this seesaw of, on the one hand, married clergy, and on the other hand, celebrity celibates. One of my famous favorites is Simon Stylites, who sat on the top of a column in Syria to the greater glory of God for decades. And he was so admired that there was almost a mini city that was built up around the base of his column because people were admiring him so much. And he had correspondence with the emperor. So there's a tremendous amount of charisma that goes along with these celibate celebrities, if they're not condemned. On the other hand, if there are women being ascetic and following around a bishop who falls out of favor, a story with them, Priscillian ends up killed by the Christian government because he's accused of magic and heresy because he's leading a group of female celibates around, and this is considered a no-fly zone.
I want to wrap up with one question, if I can ask you, because I was watching a documentary the other day, and basically the idea of this documentary was to ask the question: why did Christianity succeed? What made Christianity so unique that it became the dominant religion of Europe and all this kind of stuff. And I wanted to throw that at you in light of this book. How would you react to a question like that? Does it make any sense at all, or like what's the kind of takeaway as you look at these early Christianities, as you call them?
Well, I think in terms of the triumph of Christianity, Eusebius, one of the first church historians, would be very pleased because that's how he packaged and sold the Constantinian revolution. He was almost a court biographer of Constantine. Which Christianity? And there were always multiple Christianities, and Christians were always vigorously various. You have, I mean, if you look at European history in particular, there are always shoots and communities that come off, and then a bishop may or may not like. If the bishop sponsors them, they're okay. If not, not. So you have to wonder what the triumph really means. Does it actually mean the conversion of Christianity to a form of Roman government? Is that a triumph?
It was, it was an interesting question for me to ponder too. And I thought there's so much evolution and so much change within Christianity that the idea that it started as a coherent set of ideas and birthed something is not so much the proper story as that it was constantly, as you say in your book, is constantly in flux and in change and reactionary. And what was that quote at Orthodoxy? The greatest enemy of Orthodoxy is time. I think that's a really
right. Orthodoxy has a shelf life.
Orthodoxy has a shelf life. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So the book, I'll hold it up one more time. Ancient Christianities, the first 500 years. I'll see if I can get it into frame here. There it is. Paula Fredriksen. I'll leave links to that below just to let people know you can link off below. It's a fantastic read, and I think a really good read, even for somebody who doesn't have a deep. Some of my guests are very write books that are very kind of more academic leaning, and this is a great one for anybody. Anybody who wants to read will get a really fantastic overview of the birth of Christianities. So Paula Fredriksen, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.